Tonight's story takes us back to 1979, to a quiet house on the edge of a small American town, a place that looked ordinary, unnoticed, and harmless. But beneath that house, hidden behind concrete and iron, a dark secret waited for years. This is not just a horror story. It is a story about silence, control, and the kind of evil that survives because no one chooses to look. Listen carefully, because some of the darkest places are not far away. They are closer than you think. In 1979, far from crowded cities and busy highways, there stood a quiet house on the edge of a small American town. The kind of place people rarely noticed and quickly forgot. Trees surrounded it like silent witnesses, and the wind seemed to linger longer there, whispering through broken branches and rusted fences. Inside that house lived a man and his daughter. She was 18 years old enough to question things, old enough to feel when something was wrong, yet still young enough to trust the man who had raised her. To the outside world, he was a hard-working, quiet father. To her, he was simply Dad, the man who fixed things when they broke, the man who spoke little but watched everything. That evening, they were in the basement. The basement was not a place she liked. It sat beneath the house like a buried secret, cold and heavy, with concrete walls that seemed to absorb sound. A single hanging bulb flickered above them, casting long, trembling shadows. The air smelled of metal, oil, and something older, something that felt trapped. They were repairing a large iron door bolted into one of the basement walls. She never remembered when the door had first appeared there. It had always been part of the house, like an unwanted scar, thick, rusted, reinforced from the outside. It didn't lead anywhere obvious, just darkness beyond it. Her father said it was for safety. He never explained more. "Hold the light steady," he said calmly. She nodded and adjusted the lamp, her hands slightly cold despite the work gloves. As he tightened bolts and checked the hinges, the sound of metal echoed through the basement, sharp and hollow. Each clang seemed louder than it should have been. Time passed slowly. Then she felt it. That quiet, uncomfortable sensation of being watched. She lifted her eyes, meaning to ask a simple question, but the words never came. Her father had stopped working. He was standing very still, staring at her. Not through her, at her. Something in his eyes had changed. They no longer carried familiarity or warmth. They were sharp, focused, empty in a way she had never seen before. For a moment, she wondered if the flickering light was playing tricks on her. "Dad?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Her heart began to beat faster, though she couldn't explain why. Nothing had happened yet. Everything felt different. The basement seemed smaller, the walls closer. "You look tired," he finally said. His voice was calm, too calm. Before she could respond, dizziness washed over her. Sudden, overwhelming. The floor felt unstable beneath her feet. Her thoughts scattered, slipping away faster than she could hold them. "What?" she whispered. The lamp slipped from her hand and hit the concrete floor. The light shattered. Darkness swallowed the room, broken only by the faint hum of the hanging bulb above. Her legs gave out. As she fell, the last thing she heard was the slow, deliberate movement of the iron door. Metal against metal. A sound that echoed far longer than it should have. Then everything went quiet. And above the silence, the house remained exactly as it always had, ordinary, still, and unaware of what had just begun beneath its floors. She didn't know how much time had passed when consciousness slowly returned. At first, there was only darkness. Not the gentle darkness of closed eyes, but a thick, heavy blackness that pressed against her senses. Her head throbbed. Her mouth was dry. When she tried to move, her body responded slowly, as if it no longer fully belonged to her. A low hum filled the air. She opened her eyes. The light was dim, a single bulb fixed high above, protected by a metal cage. It cast a dull, yellow glow over concrete walls and a bare floor. The space was small, too small. The ceiling felt low, closing in on her with every breath. She was lying on a thin mattress. For a moment, confusion kept panic at bay. She tried to piece things together. The basement, the iron door, her father's eyes, the dizziness. Her heart began to race. She pushed herself up, ignoring the wave of nausea that followed. Her wrists were free. Her legs were free. Yet something felt unmistakably wrong. The air itself felt controlled, stale, recycled, trapped. "Dad?" she called out. Her voice echoed weakly, swallowed almost immediately by the concrete. No answer. She stood, her legs trembling, and took a step forward. The room was part of something larger, a narrow corridor leading into deeper darkness. Pipes ran along the walls, dripping slowly, counting time drop by drop. Then she saw the door, the iron door, now viewed from the inside. Thick, reinforced, no handle on her side, only smooth metal and a small, grated opening near the top, just large enough for air or for someone to look through. A memory surfaced suddenly, sharp and painful. "It's for safety." Her breathing became shallow. She knocked on the door. Once, twice, then harder. The sound rang hollow, lifeless. The metal didn't even tremble. "Dad, this isn't funny," she said, forcing calm into her voice. Still nothing. Minutes passed, or hours. Time had already begun to lose meaning. Finally, footsteps echoed from beyond the door. Slow, measured. The small grated opening slid open with a harsh scrape. She stepped back instinctively. Her father's face appeared behind the metal bars. Not angry, not emotional, calm, observing. Relief surged through her chest and shattered just as quickly. "Why am I here?" she asked. "What's going on?" He studied her in silence, as if weighing something only he could see. When he spoke, his voice carried no hesitation. "This is where you're safe," he said. Her stomach dropped. "Safe from what?" she whispered. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he glanced around the room, inspecting it like a craftsman checking his work. "You won't need much," he continued. "Food, water, time." Time. The word echoed louder than anything else. "You can't keep me here," she said, her voice shaking now. "People will notice. They'll ask questions." A faint smile touched his lips. Not warm, not cruel, just certain. "They already stopped," he said quietly. The opening slammed shut. She rushed forward, pounding on the door with both fists now. Her fear spilled over, raw and uncontrollable. She shouted until her throat burned, until her voice cracked and faded into hoarse whispers. No one came. When exhaustion finally forced her to the floor, the truth began to settle in, slow and suffocating. This place wasn't temporary. This wasn't a mistake. It was prepared. Above her, somewhere beyond layers of concrete and earth, the house continued its quiet existence. The sun rose, the town moved on, cars passed, lives continued. And beneath it all, a new world had begun, sealed behind iron and silence. At first, she counted the days. She scratched faint marks into the concrete wall with a loose fragment of stone she found near the corner of the room. One mark for each time the light above flickered on and off in what she assumed was a full day. Morning, night, or something close to it. But the routine was never exact. Sometimes the light stayed on longer. Sometimes it went dark without warning. Time, she realized, was no longer hers to measure. It belonged to whoever controlled the switch on the other side of the iron door. Food arrived through a narrow slot near the bottom of the door. Simple meals. Always enough to survive, never enough to feel human. Water followed. Clean, cold, silent. He never spoke when delivering it. She tried everything in those early weeks, shouting, reasoning, threatening, crying. She promised silence. She promised obedience. She promised nothing at all. None of it mattered. When he did speak, his words were short and carefully chosen, as if he were explaining rules rather than responding to a person. "This is how things are now. You don't need to understand. You're not meant to leave." Above ground, the world continued to move. People asked questions at first. Neighbors noticed her absence. Someone mentioned her name to the local sheriff. There were a few visits, a few polite conversations, a few unanswered knocks at the door. But the house revealed nothing. No screams reached the surface, no signs of struggle, no evidence of a crime, just a quiet man living a quiet life in a quiet place. Eventually, questions faded. Months passed. Her wall filled with marks, then stopped. Counting no longer brought comfort. It only reminded her of how much time had been taken. Her body adapted in ways she didn't recognize at first. Hunger became normal. Silence became familiar. Fear settled into something duller, heavier, a constant presence rather than a sharp edge. The basement expanded. Not physically, but in her mind. She discovered additional rooms connected by narrow corridors. Storage spaces, utility areas, all built deliberately, all sealed off from the outside world. This wasn't a basement meant for storage. It was a system. At night, or what she believed to be night, she lay awake listening. Pipes groaned, water dripped. Sometimes she heard movement above. Footsteps, a chair scraping across the floor. The sound of a radio playing faintly, distorted by layers of earth and concrete. Proof that life still existed somewhere else. One day she dared to ask a question she had avoided. "How long?" she said through the door. There was a pause. "As long as necessary," came the answer. Necessary for what? She never asked that part out loud, because deep down she already knew the truth wasn't something she wanted spoken. The realization didn't come all at once. It arrived slowly in fragments, in the careful way the rooms were prepared, in the controlled delivery of food, in the absolute certainty behind his voice. This place was not built to hold someone temporarily. It was built to hold a future. She pressed her palm against the cold iron door and closed her eyes. Somewhere above her, seasons were changing. Leaves were falling, snow was melting. Years were beginning without her. And beneath it all, the basement remained unchanged, waiting. Time no longer moved in straight lines. It folded in on itself, stretching and shrinking in ways she could no longer measure. Days blurred into months. Months dissolved into years. Her reflection changed slowly in the dull metal surfaces around her older eyes, quieter movements. A face shaped by endurance rather than hope. The basement changed too. What had once been silence was no longer empty. At first it was subtle. New sounds layered themselves into the darkness, soft breathing where there had been none. Faint movement behind walls she had never noticed before. The space that once felt lifeless now carried presence. Life. She was no longer alone. The children grew in the only world they knew. Concrete floors replaced grass. Dim bulbs replaced sunlight. The hum of pipes replaced birds and wind. They learned to walk along narrow corridors, to speak in hushed voices, to recognize footsteps by sound alone. They asked questions. What is outside? Why is the ceiling so low? What is the light above the stairs? She struggled to answer. How do you describe a sky to someone who has never seen blue? How do you explain freedom when you've forgotten how it feels yourself? Above them all stood one unchanging rule. He controlled everything: food, light, space, silence. To the children, he was not a father in the traditional sense. He was an authority, a shadow that appeared and disappeared without warning, a presence that demanded obedience without explanation. They learned quickly. Disobedience brought consequences they didn't fully understand but feared deeply. So they followed the structure given to them. They adapted. Children always do. As years passed, the numbers grew. The basement expanded again, more rooms, more walls, more divisions. It became a small underground world, functioning by its own twisted logic. Older children were given responsibilities. Younger ones followed their lead. Family became a confusing concept. Words lost their meaning, relationships blurred, titles shifted. The natural order of things eroded under isolation and control. Without reference to the outside world, nothing felt wrong to them, it simply was. But to her, every day was a quiet struggle to remember. She whispered stories at night about trees, about rain, about standing in open fields and feeling the wind without walls around you. The children listened with wide eyes, absorbing these impossible images like myths. Is it real? They asked. Yes, she said, even when doubt crept into her own voice. Some nights she lay awake counting their breathing, wondering how many lives had begun underground, how many would never know the sun unless something changed. And still, the house above remained silent. The town aged. New families moved in. Old ones left. The quiet man continued his quiet existence, unremarkable and unseen. The truth stayed buried, until the first crack appeared. It came not with violence, but with curiosity. One of the older children began to ask different questions, not about the outside, but about him. And once that question existed, it could not be unasked. The first sign of change was not rebellion. It was awareness. The older children began to notice patterns, not the kind that could be explained with words they understood, but patterns they felt. The way certain doors were locked longer than others. The way the light schedule shifted without reason. The way he watched, always watching, measuring more than behavior. They noticed how roles were assigned. Who slept where? Who worked with whom? Who was separated? Who was brought together? Nothing was random. To them, it had always been this way. The underground world ran on rules they had never questioned because questioning was never encouraged. Rules meant order. Order meant safety. That was what they were told. But one of them, the oldest, began to listen differently. He noticed how her voice changed when she spoke of the past, how her stories carried weight, not wonder, how her eyes avoided certain corridors, how silence fell heavier whenever footsteps approached. One night when the others slept, he asked her quietly, "Was it always like this?" She froze. The question struck deeper than he could have known. Her mouth opened, but no words came. The truth crowded her thoughts, pressing forward, dangerous and fragile. "No," she finally said. That single word shifted something in the air. From that moment on, doubt spread quietly, not like fire, but like water seeping through cracks. Invisible at first. Impossible to stop once it found a path. The children began to whisper. They compared memories, small ones, inconsistencies, things that didn't add up. Why were they not allowed near the stairs? Why was the iron door never opened from their side? Why did the world end at concrete? He noticed the change too. Control tightened. Rules became stricter. Lights were rationed. Rooms were rearranged. Voices were silenced more quickly than before. The underground world shrank emotionally, even as it expanded physically. Fear returned sharper this time. She felt it in herself as well. The fragile balance she had maintained for years, survival without resistance, was breaking. The children were no longer just surviving. They were thinking. And thinking was dangerous. One evening, the iron door opened longer than usual. He stood there, scanning faces, his eyes calculating. Not angry. Never angry. Anger was uncontrolled. This was something else. "You've been talking," he said calmly. No one answered. His gaze landed on her. "You're filling their heads with things they don't need." She met his eyes for the first time in years. "They deserve to know there's more," she said quietly. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not guilt, not doubt, annoyance. "This is all they need," he replied. "I made sure of that." The door closed. But it closed too late. Because once the idea of more exists, it cannot be erased. That night, the oldest child didn't sleep. He listened. He counted footsteps. He memorized the rhythm of the house above. And for the first time, someone in the underground began to plan not just to survive, but to change the ending. Plans were never spoken out loud. Words carried risk. Sound traveled. Silence, however, could hide intention. The oldest child understood that instinctively. He watched. He listened. He learned the underground the same way someone learns a language, slowly, carefully, without drawing attention. The house above followed patterns. Morning footsteps, evening radio noise. The exact moment when the iron door unlocked, the seconds it remained open, the way the light shifted when someone moved across the living room floor upstairs. For years, control had flowed in one direction only. Until it didn't, the opportunity came quietly. A mistake, a moment of overconfidence. The iron door opened one evening, and for the first time it stayed open longer than usual. He stepped inside to inspect a repair, distracted by something unseen above. The underground held its breath. The oldest child moved without hesitation. What followed was not chaos, not violence, just a sudden, irreversible shift in power. A door that was never meant to be closed from the inside was closed. Locked. Silence returned. But this time it belonged to someone else. Above them, the house waited unaware, unprepared, fragile. They climbed the stairs slowly, step by step, each movement heavier than the last. The air changed as they rose, less damp, less stale, different. The door at the top opened. Light flooded in. Real light. It hurt their eyes. They shielded their faces, blinking, overwhelmed. The world was larger than any story she had ever told. Higher, louder, endless. They stood there, frozen between two worlds, one buried, one forgotten. She stepped forward first. Her legs shook, but she didn't stop. Outside, the town looked ordinary. Cars parked along the road, houses with open windows, people living lives untouched by what had existed beneath their feet for decades. Someone screamed when they saw them. Phones appeared. Voices rose. Questions collided with confusion. Authorities arrived. Doors were opened that had never been meant to open. Concrete walls were exposed. Rooms were counted. Evidence surfaced slowly, painfully. The house became a place no one could ignore anymore. News reports called it many things: a crime, a mystery, a nightmare. But none of those words captured the truth, because the truth was simpler and far more unsettling. Evil hadn't hidden in shadows. It had lived quietly, patiently, behind closed doors, protected by normalcy and silence. As she stood wrapped in a blanket under flashing lights, she looked back at the house one last time. At the windows, at the roof, at the ground that had held her life hostage for so long. The sun was rising. For the first time in decades, it rose for her too. And somewhere deep beneath the noise and movement, one thought echoed clearly in her mind. The darkest places aren't always underground. Sometimes they're built right beneath ordinary homes and left there, untouched, because no one thought to look.